Thank you for coming. I'm very excited to be here. In Denmark, we have a big debate now about finally having private universities. So it's great to actually be at a private university. So that's great. Copenhagen Business School used to be a private university, but in some kind of Keynesian delusion, it was gifted to the state, right? Which is just a horrible idea. Same thing with University of Aarhus, actually. So hopefully we can conquer some of that back. I'm going to do 3 things today. By the way, if you're interested in the slides for whatever reason, I can email them. If you don't understand what I'm saying, speak too fast, whatever, please just stop and ask. It's better than me wasting your time. So I'm going to do 3 things. I'm going to talk about the paper, which is a spin-off of the book, The Welfare State as a Tradition. As an economist going into the field of history, you realize that history always sort of like takes second chair when you're working, because you have current affairs, and then history will always be there. So this paper has been like I've been working on it for a while, but I need to prioritize and get it out there and submit it. Before I do that, I'll just briefly get you a fly-in to Denmark and why this paper is interesting and the background of it. And before that, because we are in a free market center, I'm going to advertise my podcast. It's not like it costs any money, but it's just good to advertise, right? It's a good feel, right? So as already mentioned, I do have a podcast if you're interested. It's called Econ Roots. It's on the history of economic thought. And the first season, skip that because it's in Danish. You won't understand it, but it's a classical introduction to the history of economic thought. That actually turned out to be very popular. So can I recommend doing that, by the way, if it's not available in Britain somehow. But then from the second season onwards, we do it in English. And we have regular episodes where we, over time, will cover every Nobel laureate in economics, right? And we do it in the way that we have 3 of them sort of like speaking together in an episode. So it's not chronologically, because that would be horribly boring and confusing. But instead we do it by topic, right? But then we also have some really fun interviews, and we have 5 coming out now. We have Jerry C. Mueller, who's one of the greatest experts on capitalism from Catholic University of America. Really recommend that episode. We have Chris Coyne on peace, who's at George Mason University, and all these great, interesting people. So the interview episodes are really fun. So please listen. I have some flyers if you're interested. That was the first bit of intro. So in order to understand Denmark, let's just kill one myth right off. We are not a socialist country. Okay, it's very important to understand. And in a way, I can show it with this picture. This is a promotional picture of products from the beginning of the 80s. And you just have to be amazed at how many products are here for such a small country, right? No socialist country would be able to produce this variety of goods and innovation, right? It's simply not impossible. I don't need to explain that. It wouldn't be possible. And we have so many great goods here. Some of them are still around today. So the reason why I say some of it is you can see there's a mink fur coat here. And one of the great scandals during the COVID lockdown in Denmark was that the government illegally closed down the whole mink trade and still haven't paid out settlements and so on. But so that's a dead business now, but by fault of government. So we're not a socialist country. We are a fairly successful country, actually. So 200 years ago, Denmark was on the brink of extinction. We bet on the wrong horse during the Napoleonic Wars. Our government was bankrupt. You guys took our navy. So, so we didn't have a bargaining chip, and we used to be an empire. We still consider ourselves an empire, sort of like those football teams that used to be in Europe, right? Who still consider themselves big teams. You know those. You know the ones. I'm not going to mention any of them anyway. So we were basically done for, and that is a time of history where most European nations disappeared. So there was a unification of Germany, the unification of Italy, and so on. So it's very likely that we would disappear as a nation. But we got a second chance because you guys, thankfully, wanted a buffer state between Germany and Sweden. And also because it seems sort of weird to fight against Napoleon to establish the sovereignty of the monarchy and then establish the oldest monarchy in Europe, right? So sort of had to like keep that around, I guess. So those are the 2 bargaining chips, the lucky chips we had. And then we started a period of liberal reforms in Denmark, founded especially on freedom of speech, but also freedom of trade, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion. And that actually in the next 100 years took us to become one of the richest countries per capita in Europe, right? So 100 years ago, we were one of the richest countries per capita in Europe. Great success story. Politically, it was a bit back and forth. right? The country became smaller. We had a conservative dictatorship for a while and so on, but economically, really well. Now we are, so going forward, the welfare state, which I'm going to talk a lot about today, is established in Denmark. You can discuss the precise date, but around 1960. Let's just take that for now. And it very quickly goes wrong. So when I was born in 82, the budget minister, who's a social democrat, has a very famous quote saying, "We're looking into the abyss." They were literally on the brink of bankruptcy once again, which happened really quickly. So they started a period of reforms, which took us to, at the end of the 20th century, becoming around the 12th richest OECD country per capita, and now we're the 6th richest OECD country. So we are a country, we're a success story, because we don't really have anything, we don't have a lot of natural resources. So this is a result of good, sound policy mainly, right? So this is why I think Denmark is an interesting case story. Another thing that this also illustrates, sorry, this is gross domestic product, sorry, this is in Danish, is that we are rich, we're very productive, but we don't like to work a lot. And the answer is taxes, right? At least it's part of the answer. Another part of the answer is also, why are you actually working when you're rich? It's a very simple question, but what's the point of it? And one of the main debates now in Denmark is that most people, and I'll give you some of the answers to why I think that is, both on the right, left and the right, are sort of in agreement on the margins when it comes to tax levels, unfortunately. So what we're debating now in welfare policy is the redistribution of your life, basically, on many levels. So are you supposed to work for your loved ones, your preferences, your family, or is there actually a purpose in working for the greater good of the welfare state? And this sounds insane, but this is an argument made, literally made by one of our ministers, the social democratic ministers, that you should be happy if you pick up your kid late from daycare because you're doing something good for the welfare state. Like, this is like literally an argument out there now. And that's because if people don't work more, the welfare state, the way we do it in Denmark at least, doesn't hold up economically. The business model breaks down. We need people to work. We need two working parents who work a lot, as much as possible. Otherwise, there's not enough, right? So that is good to know why this is relevant. Another thing is that there's a lot. So a part of my job is I give a lot of high school talks. I give almost 100 high school talks a year, which is a fun way to get to learn so many young Danish people. And when they're being educated in Denmark, in Danish high schools, they're being met with a historical narrative that starts after we're rich, which is something that the Social Democratic Party has perfected. So they sort of like take riches for given, right? And then they talk about, how the welfare state is a great innovation and so on. So they're quite clever in that. So some of the research that I'm doing is trying to challenge that narrative and saying we need to start it earlier. How did we become rich? How did we go from destitution and being destitute, to becoming really rich? That's an interesting story. And then we can talk about why did we spend that on a welfare state? That would be the next interesting bit, right? And then, is there a difference between the welfare state as it was envisioned and what it is now, which I argue there isn't, but anyway. So this is a lot of what's going on, just to give you some background, because it is sort of weird that Denmark should be a welfare state, just again, because we, for most of our history, has been a classical liberal society. Very much so. I'll give you some examples of this, because I think many people don't know this, even many Danish people. So this guy, Snorri Sturluson, he's an Icelandic guy, but that used to be part of Denmark, right? So I know that's a sensitive topic over here, what used to be part of, right? But anyway, well, I think they've forgiven us anyway. So he writes a book about Norwegian kings, and he has a very clear definition saying the good Norwegian kings are the kings that obey the law, and the bad Norwegian kings are the ones that disobey the law. That is a pretty classical liberal idea of viewing the state, that the state should be ruled by law, not by man, right? This is pretty early. We have actually an early Danish parliament, right, which was fairly fine, you could argue, classical liberal. This guy's Swedish, but since he has these ideas in Stockholm at the time, they were prevalent in Denmark as well. And he's saying a lot of the same stuff that Adam Smith says. So these ideas are some stuff that was, debated and understood in the Nordics. This thing here is our liberty pillar. I love this picture because there's an advertisement for bacon in the background. It's very Danish. Anyway, it was put up when people were given freedom of movement, which had been taken away after the Great Plague, but instead we also get conscription. So the Danish idea of the state is a bargaining idea between the people and the sovereign. And that can be argued to be a classical liberal understanding of the state. The state is something that we give sovereignty to do some things, but it's only because we need to be free to do what we really want to do, right? And then of course you have a guy like Grundtvig, very classical liberal. We have a guy like Stefan Kirkegaard, very classical liberal, if you read his guide. And I'll even argue that this thing here, which is the birth certificate of Denmark, is also very classical liberal, because it shows, so the story behind this is Harald Bluetooth, who christened the Danes. Why did he do that? He did it to avoid a crusade from the German emperor, right? And he then needed to convince everybody that he should be supreme king. How do you convince somebody of that? So he makes this big stone, and this is the back side of it. And you see it's probably a horse and it's a snake. Now, why would he chose these two images? And we don't really know. What I'm arguing right now, I talked to archaeologists about it and historians. They say you might be right, but of course we'll never know because no written sources and so on. But I think what he tried to convey here was saying to the free people, and the free people of Denmark back then would have horses, right? So a horse is a picture of wealth, freedom. Saying, listen, you have to allow the snake of the state. You have to carry the snake of the state, who might bite you, but could also protect you. Because in heraldry, the heraldry of the German emperor is an eagle, and they win over everything, except sometimes a snake. So I think what he's saying, you have to accept and carry the snake of the state in order to potentially be free from the eagle, right? So an eagle can kill a horse, right? If it's persistent enough. So anyway, we have a long tradition of this. We even have a good term for being center-right in Denmark, or classical liberal. It's a Danish term, it's called borgerlig. It comes from German Burg, which means inside, outside. Some people are part Burg citizens, some people are not. They have rights and responsibilities, duties, and so on because of that. And then equality. So this is like basically citizen equality, we would translate this into. And this is a fundamental idea why we became rich. So this is a little bit background. So what about welfare state ideas? Are they Danish? They're definitely not Danish, okay? So they are modern, first of all. The welfare state ideas comes to Denmark after the Second World War. And I'll give you a little bit more historical background as I get into the paper. They come from over here in Germany, which for all your many blessings, you are not a small state. You are in a very unique empire and so on, and a whole other trajectory in terms of your history at that point than we were, right? And the same as Germany. And it's now totally dominating public debates, which I'll get to an end with because of the title of the paper, the welfare state as a tradition, right? So right now, just to finish that up and then get into the paper, and it's going to be very tedious and boring and very theoretically, but so, just to finish that up, I think the Danish welfare state is in danger of becoming like the Emperor Without Clothes fairy tale of H.K. Andersen, if you know that one. The small boy calling out the emperor with no clothes on. Because today we are unbelievably rich in Denmark, which is great. I always remind people of that fact because people take it for granted. I just don't think we should take riches for granted. It's great. However, our welfare state isn't in danger of becoming like this. So this is actually a quote I put in here from the Prime Minister, the world's best welfare state, welfare society, not even state, society, the world's best welfare society. However, that is also a welfare society where, and these are all real examples, cancer patients are lied to, care home residents are slandered, the primary school fails, like 20% of our kids now leave school without being able to read. Children are forcibly removed without just reason, courts with endless waiting time, an army that cannot defend its country, and endless development goal hysteria. So is this something to be proud of? I don't think so, right? So that was a bit of background. Let's get to the paper now. I hope that made sense, just to place you in a Danish content. And let's get to the actual paper here. So I call the paper the welfare state as a tradition. So this started out with me asking a research question as to why did the Danish state organization grow rapidly from 1960s onwards. Okay, I'll give you some examples. This is public spending. If we go back like even earlier, it would be around 5, but that took around almost 50 years to get us to that level. But what happens here? That is a pretty insane increase, right? We see an equal increase in public employees as percentage of labor force. And we also see a fairly great increase in income transfer to private individuals. So something happens around this time. Why does it happen here? Like, I'll also give you another example, is if we take the number of public employees and the recipients of public support, recipients meaning those who are mainly relying on public support for their income, in 1970, so that's a little bit later than 1960, but still compared to now, and see how many people are voting age, we now have a clear majority of people who are mainly relying on government transfer for their income, right? So something has happened here that's fundamentally changed what kind of society Denmark is. We went from being a very free market, liberal, classical liberal society to being a social state. Why did that happen? Okay, so that is what the paper tried to explain, and so my contributions are the following here. I have 2 of these why care slides. So this is, by the way, a framework I force my students to do all the time. Like, relevance, interesting, and necessity. If they cannot answer this, I don't want to read their papers. So like, you know. So what's the relevance of this? This is a large institutional changes. These are rare, but they do, right? So here we have a case of it. Denmark is an oft referred to case, but understood, right? In Sanders to Fox News, understand anything about Denmark, right? This is also interesting because the change, while being so fundamental, is not revolutionary. It's not a violent overthrow. It's something that happened evolutionary, and that's, as classical liberals, especially people like me who are inspired by Hayek, that is interesting. Evolution is more interesting than revolution, oftentimes, I find. We have a novel use of theory, which I'll go into in some details today, where we use something called failed state theory, along with the public choice, institutional logic, and even a bit of Marxism. So you are going to be bored today by theory, but it's important. And if you don't understand any of these terms now, hopefully you will in 10 minutes, okay? Bear with me. And then, of course, it's necessary as a myth buster. The last reason why you should care is, this is a test I always do my work actually hold explanatory power or predictive power, or ideally both? And I think this actually has potential to hold both. It has explanatory power because it explains why it happened, why these graphs start changing the way it did. And it also has predictive power because we're stuck with a big problem in Denmark now, is that most people, even pretty far out on the left, acknowledges to reform the welfare state, but it's almost impossible to do, okay? What's happening instead is that we're getting to changing our fundamental ideas about what is right and wrong, ethically speaking, and that is an issue. I took the most current example of this. This is a thing I published in the main Danish newspaper today. I was also on the radio about it earlier. And it's about the government now wanting to change our organ donation so that we are automatically assigned to it. I know you already have that system here, but we actually, back in Denmark, we're supposed to sign up ourselves, which I think is a better, from a classical liberal viewpoint, system, because you own your own body. The government doesn't own your body. And now they want to change that for technocratic reasons, which I think is a horrible drawback. So we're debating this a little. By the way, I was quite proud of this title. It's called "Only You Can Decide Who You Give Your Heart To." Right? So I thought that was really romantic. Anyway, almost on Valentine's Day, right? So anyway. So what kind of theory do I use in the paper? I use something called institutional logic that I'm a big fan of. Basically, the theory goes, there's a person called Vinson who came up with it, that there are 4 main institutional logics that are always competing against each other. So they can all be present in a country, but one of them will be dominating. It can lead to sort of similar outcomes, but they will be fighting it out. So we have like a classical liberal one, free market one. We have a social one, welfare state one, development one, and a directly socialist or totalitarian model, right? As you can see here, we can have the same kind of policy, but for different reasons and different likelihoods. So something like tax-funded daycare could happen in a liberal logic because it frees up people to work. However, it forces specific choices on family and might limit innovation, right? So it's more likely to happen in a social logic where, you also need to free people up to work. You might argue that it can be emancipating for certain exposed groups like women and immigrants. And your country is that resources might not be optimally distributed. So what I argue here, or not argue, I think this is a pretty well-established fact, that Denmark goes from a classical liberal with a conservative twist logic in the beginning of the century to a social logic at the end of the century. And that is interesting. Why does that happen? Okay, it didn't need to happen. Then I put this in, and now a lot of Danes get angry because you don't like to have your country called a failed state. But I argue that Denmark at a period in the 20th century became a failed state. And that is provocative, I grant you that. So what is a failed state? Well, a non-failed state, a functioning state, must have legitimacy and efficiency in order to exist, right? So failed states lack one or both of those aspects. And right now there's a failed state index, and I think it's like around 40-something states that are on that are failed to some degree or other. Somalia being the obvious case, but there are many others, right? So a failed state loses control over territory, right, or the monopoly of the use of violence within that. There's an erosion of legitimacy to exercise collective decisions. They are unable to deliver public goods and services like policing, roads, and so on. And it's not a full and equal member of the international community, right? This one is probably the least important to the people living in the country. But anyway, it's still on the list if you look at the theory. And then the last theory I use is actually a methods theory. And it's a guy called Hobsbawm, and he talks a lot about how traditions actually happen. And tradition, which is also an institution, if you read Douglas North and so on, is in turbulent times, in times where the country, especially outside forces, a national populace will seek to build a shared culture or identity and so on. And when they do that, they start to invent traditions. This is where you see traditions happening, right? So he's interested in that because he wants to see how traditions can, exploit people and so on. I'm interested in it for something else. I'm interested in why they happen. And if they're successful in building new traditions, he argues, we can have new national identity as a result of that. So we can change who we are as a nation by the traditions that we believe in, which comes because we're threatened as a group of people. Does this make sense? So that's sort of his arguments, right? And I argue in this paper that the dominance of thought that the welfare state has in modern Danish politics, and while it might be different from what we originally thought, it has now been accepted that more or less the public are there to serve the institutions, right? So, give you an example of this. I'm going to use a meme now, because you can hear the Danish accent in this. This is why it's spelled like that. In Denmark, we actually get paid to study. So this is Zelensky. This is a Danish politician called Janne Jørgensen. And whenever I ask people what's the first thing you talk about when you're supposed to explain Denmark, they always mention that you get paid to study. Like I can do this all the time with young people, other people. And it's a horrible and perfect example because our transfer to pay students to go to school is a transfer from the poor to the rich. It's nothing to be proud of the way it is now. It's totally on solidarity and so on. But people, this is the first thing they mention. People are nationally proud of this fact. Right? The fact that you steal from the poor to give to the rich, right? Why? So, and I argue that that is based on a tradition, right? So how did it then happen? Well, I built this model, right? So we have a starting state here where I say we are a failed state. We go through some stages that I'm going to explain, and then we come out to the growth and state sides, which is the research question I wanted to answer, right? So I'm going to explain these P1, 2, and 3. To take you through it. So what's the starting point? Why are we a failed state at one point during the 20th century? Well, to understand that, we can go even further back, but at least we can go back to 1864, where we lost to Germany. And the legitimacy of the Danish state becomes very clear from that point, keeps the German out, right? Remain a sovereign country, do not become German, right? And the efficiency is from continued market reforms, opening up and liberalizing society, which happens a lot here. okay? However, Germany do eventually take over, right? The Nazis roll in their tanks and their planes and so on and take us over in 1940. And for a while we have an appeasement policy, but when that breaks down in 1943, the Danish state is a de facto failed state. There are no legitimacy. There's a breakdown of the rule of law, so there's no efficiency anymore. And we are actually threatened as a sovereign state, even with a German loss, because especially the Russians argued that we had been too appeasing of the Germans, right? So, you know, we are literally now lost, right? We are a failed state. However, what's interesting is the Danish state as an organization continues. The police is being put away, the army, but the rest is still there, right? So the state organization is there. There's just purpose to it. Denmark has, however, always had very high, or at least for the time we have data on, high pre-existing trust levels. And what is interesting about Danish trust levels is that it goes both to other Danes, to other businesses, and to the government. Danish people tend to trust the government a lot, and that's always done it. So after the Germans are kicked out, thankfully, with you guys' help, among other things, right? And we get to convince the world that we are actually part of the free Western world and shouldn't be drawn into the Iron Curtain. The Danes are actually interested in having a government that has some sort of legitimacy. Danes are not interested in not having a government. We're classical liberals, but we do actually think government serves a purpose. So they're looking for somebody to come up with a purpose. That's the first part, right? So the pre-existing high trust level of trust both enabled and demanded new state legitimacy. Then we have special interest groups, right? We have two very important special interest groups now. And if you know public choice theory, you know special interest groups are important for democracy, because if they're well organized, well liked, they can take over a lot of legislative body, right? And we have two of those at this point in history. We have the unions and the Social Democrats, right? But we also have the agricultural sector, who at this point is desperate to give something to their electorate, because they faced an very increasing foreign competition at the level, and they needed to simply have something to offer their voting populace. This could have been stopped because we used to have a House of Lords, but that was abolished in 1953. So there's no stopping now for redistribution. The Danish constitution is a total minority rule constitution. It's only the king who can literally stop a law, basically. Well, a minister can as well, but why? But then they just get fired, so that doesn't really make any sense. The king are the only person that can stop it because this was taken out. Okay, so my second proposition is special interest group gave pretense to a new. So none of that makes any sense if you have no money. You can't redistribute poverty. Well, you can redistribute poverty, I guess, but you need in order to distribute, right? And for a couple of years after the Second World War, Denmark was relatively poor until like 1950, and then it happens. There's a huge growth boom, and now there's all of a sudden a lot of money to redistribute, right? And we see this. So two interesting facts: the growth of Danish industrial goods export grew from 1.5 to 4.4 billion UK between 1950 and 1958. Huge boom of exports, huge. But we also see at the same time, which goes back to the special interest group, that the labor force changed as well. So we go from being a mainly agricultural labor to being mainly an industrial labor force. So economic growth made it possible. Okay, so now we have a situation where we have a populace that wants to have a new purpose for the government. We have special interest groups who are offering a new purpose, which is redistribution, and now we have money to do it. Okay. So the result becomes state growth and a new national identity. So the great state organization seized the chance to grow that was granted by populist trust guided by special interest when the economy allowed it. That's the conclusion of the paper. And the results then become new legitimacy with redistribution, new efficiency with taxation. A great example of that is our social security system, which is put in here, very efficient system, especially if you want to do like statistics and so on. The government knows everything about you. And just to give you an example of this, the longest I managed to keep my kids out of the social security was like 19 seconds. But most of my my two firstborn sons went 6 months without a name because we couldn't agree. And the government doesn't care about that. And then as long as you got your barcode, you're good, okay? Which is completely different from most other countries where, you know, you cannot leave without a name, but you have to apply for a social security number, right? And then, you know, I argue because of this, the welfare state as such becomes a new national identity and a tradition. And this makes it very hard to innovate it, okay? Because the welfare state creates a norm that is hard to break even for opponents. So many officially right-of-center politicians is so embedded in the welfare state, they can't even imagine alternatives. Can't even imagine it. And they'll keep arguing for it, which is insane. The population distrusts alternatives. Like, if you argue for private, any kind of like private solution, they'll say, oh, but what about this, and that, right? They cannot imagine something not being run by government, which is weird in a so commercial country as Denmark. And it's clearly encroaching on individual rights and dignity, even more so now, as I gave you the example, right? So this also, ironically, makes public sector innovation hard, despite clearly falling marginal returns from public spending. We have lots of economic findings on that now. In fact, if you add more trained personnel to Danish daycare, it has a negative effect on social mobility, because there's already so much money spent on that. Okay? And even and clearly acknowledged bowel disease issues. This is even acknowledged by the unions now, most of them. Not so much the public sector ones, but the private ones acknowledge this, right? But it's hard to change because of this. So this is the conclusion of the paper. There's obviously stuff to discuss. I'd love to hear your impacts. There's something about boundary conditions and general applicability, right? There's something about internal, external explanation. Are they equally weighted? So the way I did the model, they're sort of equally weighted, and it's not a quantitative model. So, you know, it's just a theoretical model, but whatever. You can also argue about what is the notion of state stability. We'll talk a little bit about that, me and my co-author. How purposeful was this development as well? I sort of argue there was a purpose for it, but you could also say it's just random chance. Like, if you believe that politics is just random chance. And then there's something about the conception of the welfare state that can be argued as well. So this is Danish, means thank you for listening. So thank you for listening.